with CEOs and millionaires. I've never seen my vision be more crystal clear. Look in the mirror, see the change in who I used to be. I kept going, knew success would come eventually. But ask about me back then, they said I wouldn't make it. Nowadays they doubt less and tend to ask for favors. Poetic music, that's realness, don't let them tell you different. And if you ever lost in doubt, then follow your intuition. These words of wisdom is for those who's trying to find their purpose. Don't be living just to die, cause only death is certain. I'm working hard so I can toast to my accomplishments. Cause see, I lost it all and I ain't been the same since. I'm more focused, more ambitious, more everything. Grew up with nothing, now I appreciate the finer things. I know it's real when at the shows they ask for autographs. And now they know the name, they ain't gotta ask. Yeah. They ain't gotta ask.
First off, thanks for doing this. You are the first person to be on the podcast twice.
Oh, wow.
So
glad to return.
There's a fun time for that. For those obviously listening, Aaron Benderski is a friend of mine, and he was also on the podcast in May talking about Israel in the context of the last engagement with Gaza, and then also some of the civil unrest that was happening within Israel during a time of just a lot of tension in the country based on the political landscape at the time. And I'll let Aaron kind of go over his background and kind of give you more the reason why I trust him and his opinion on a lot of things when we talk about Israel and the politics of Israel within. So you can elaborate on it.
So where do we start?
Go, actually, you know what? Come talk from the beginning. And so Aaron wasn't born in Israel. He moved here from Israel when he was a young kid. So we want to talk about that and that experience, growing up here, coming from another country, speaking other languages, and then that immersion process and what took place, and kind of ultimately what led you going into working in the nonprofit institutions of Israel, and then into politics as well.
Okay. So our story begins, as these stories often do, in a small town in Belarus called Vitebsk. I was born there when my mom was studying in med school. But my family originally is from a small town in Moldova called Bender. That's why I'm Benderski. Ski in all the Slavic last names means comes from.
Got it.
So I come from Bender. And from there we came in 1995 during a civil war that was there happening. If you look it up on the map, it's not even called Bender anymore. It has a different name.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's part of Transnistria now.
Yeah, I know the area.
Yeah, so right there, right on the border.
Got it.
So in 95 there was a civil war there. We moved to Israel, and we moved to Israel in late 1995, and 2 weeks later, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in Israel. So my family was like, okay, so nothing's really different here. But yeah, so I lived here as a child of immigrants, basically. I didn't know that at the time, or I didn't realize what is going on. I just knew that I was speaking one language at home, Russian, and I was speaking another language in school, which was Hebrew. And this sort of mix of cultures was something came at the expense of the other. And I remember for a lot of time I was trying to be as Israeli as I can. Mm-hmm. And so I spoke Hebrew, read books in Hebrew, knew Hebrew better than most of my classmates. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I joined a youth movement that was like a socialist youth movement that was like the salt of the earth kind of thing. I went to the army with a socialist commune, and we went for the old sort of beginning of the century sort of vision of the rooted Israeli. And it took me a while to sort of go back to my own sort of Russian culture and sort of like Russian speaking, because I wasn't Russian. And I remember after the army, from a youth movement, they came up to me and said, we at the Jewish Agency, we need people to go to summer camps in Russia to work with kids in Russian. I was like, oh, interesting. Like, my Russian background was never like needed before that. It was something to sort of like hide away or even be ashamed of in my personal view. No one really like shamed me on it.
Did you think it was a positive growing up? Because I have a very similar story. I'll let you finish your background and where that led. But did you think it was? Were you kind of a 1 foot in, 1 foot out? Did it resonate with you, like your identity yet, on like being of a mixed culture of some kind, in a sense of having a Russian identity but being Jewish? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
So the Jewish identity back in the Soviet Union was very much suppressed. So in a way, I was supposed to teach my family about what it's like to be Jewish when I was like 13, 14, and not even knowing where these traditions come from, but I was sort of the authority in the house on what is and isn't Jewish.
Right.
And I was like, I'm not even sure I'm on board with most of these things, but now I have to explain to my family like why we don't eat bread like a week out of the year or whatever. Like, and it was a process, and I don't think I realized at that time that this is like a conflict or whatever. And I sort of like, only looking back, you see like the fact that I grew up bilingual, and now I'm, I guess, trilingual.
Yeah, for sure, without a doubt.
But like, this is something that you don't realize. You don't realize the hardships, and you don't necessarily realize the benefits of it. The fact that I had another culture, but also I guess it's true for a lot of immigrants in a way, especially like a second generation, or as we are fondly called here, a generation 1.5.
Okay.
Because we're kids, we were born there, but we grew up here. So
Got it.
like, this is a term that's commonly used towards Russian Israelis right now. Generation 1.5. People sort of my age or a little older that came here when they were young, and now they're sort of like matured into this society.
Right. Do you feel that I can speak on my own journey in that sense, right? Like having to balance, like for example, in Germany, and for those that don't know, Aaron went to Germany with me to kind of learn about Jewish culture within Germany. And we had a really great time in Berlin and learning a little bit about the different factions of Jewish life that exist in the capital. But I grew up in a kind of a quasi similar situation where I was known to Americans as the Kraut, and I was known to Germans as the Ami, which is like slang for like an American, because of my parents being mixed in that sense. And it always, I never had an issue though. Like, and I know a lot of people do. I'm like trying to fit in, and for me, it was very fluid. It was just like, yeah, I got this side and I got that side. But I think it has to do with the way that my family treated us no differently, like internally, like from the German side, for example, or from the American side. They just loved us for who we were. And I think that plays a big part in it, in the sense of I can be both and it's okay. You know, I can be a binationalist. I can be a universalist where I have capitalistic tendencies, but deep down, like I'm rooted in socialism and like what's better for the group collectively, you know? And so it's kind of a weird tightrope to walk, but I think it provides empathy for both sides. When you know that you have family members that think a certain way or are a certain way, you can relate to people in a lot better ways. And I'm sure it's the same for you, where you have an idea of what particularly that person maybe that you're dealing with on some of the stuff, the work that you're doing now, on how they're feeling because you've went through that process yourself. So with that, obviously you've moved through the ranks here. You went to the military, you did that, but before that you were in the Scout. So you were really indoctrinated into Israeli society in a sense of like you were checking the boxes on like what quantifies being like a true Israeli in the sense. During that time frame, did that solidify your identity more, or did you have more questions about it as you were going through that process?
I think when I was still like you said, checking the boxes. So when I did like the gap year with my movement, and then when I went to the army, I went to a combat unit with my friends, and then went to like the education corps, and I was teaching other kids what it's like to be Israeli, or like being suddenly I was their role model of what being an Israeli is. And I was like, sometimes you get like this imposter syndrome, like, am I Israeli enough to be teaching other kids like what it is to be Israeli? But that sort of that helped solidify. And the thing is, I always thought myself of like a sometimes even a foreigner in a different culture. And because I was like, oh, I mean, I live in Israel, but I guess I'm mostly Russian. Yeah. And then I met actual Russians. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so Israeli. Yeah. I'm like, I went to these summer camps, and I worked as a security guard for like birthright trips, and we got like birthright trips from Russia. And I was like, oh, we may be speaking the same language, but I have nothing I have nothing in common with these people. Or I went to Moscow, for example, and I walked around. I went to like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and I traveled there. And I go over through the main street there. I read the signs. I'm like, okay, I can read. I understand the language. I can communicate, and yet none of this feels my own. Yeah. Like, and after that experience, I was like, okay. So maybe I'm not as Russian as I. And then I was like, okay, I'm a Russian-speaking Israeli, but I'm definitely not Russian. Right.
What were the like you were talking about, like when you met these authentic Russians, we'll call them, what was the main difference that you felt in thought, in culture, in even identity with the people that you were engaging with in the same common language, but there was obviously a big gap in differences?
So I think language was one of those things. Oh, okay. Because you'd think we're speaking the same Russian, but the thing is, I'm speaking the Russian that my parents taught me, which is the early 90s Russian. Right. And language and slang evolves for about 30 years. Yeah. So like when I was speaking to them, a lot of times I would get like comments like, oh, you speak like my parents. because I talk the way my parents taught me, and for them Russian stopped evolving in early 90s. Right. So whatever they speak, it's what I spoke, and like a bunch of slang words, and like I have Russian friends today that when I speak to them, I understand about 70% of what they're saying. Oh wow. And like I'm more or less fluent in Russian, and yet somehow this is not like some things I still don't understand, because a lot of like American slang went into it, and like went through a transformation in a way. Then you sort of like have to reverse engineer some words into English.
Right. Do you feel that your parents, because of their status, even in the old country, was of a professional nature, does that play a part in the language as far as being different? Because they probably were speaking to you in a more structured, like higher education language of Russian than just the commoner would be speaking. No,
I mean my parents were pretty much simple people. Like there wasn't a lot, like we weren't even like proper Russia. This is like Moldova. This today is like the poorest country in Europe. So but they try to be educated people as much as they can. And I was, my mom still reads a lot all the time. Right. And I was encouraged to read books all the time when we moved to Israel. So I I was reading, I think, more than any other student when I was like in elementary school.
Yeah.
And that's how I also acquired most of my Hebrew. So a lot of the times I would have many words in Hebrew that I didn't know how to pronounce, like because I've only read them in books. I was like, okay, no one's using these words, but like I know they exist. So like when I need to do essays or whatever, I could use those words, but like I didn't know how they sounded because my parents didn't speak it and no one around me spoke these.
Right. And then obviously in text, especially here, there's no vowels. So you're guessing. I definitely know the feeling of what you're talking about, because obviously I can sound out the consonants, but then you're screwing it up like a little bit variably in the word itself, and people like laugh at you and they're like, oh, that's cute. You sound like a 3-year-old. Yeah. So you got here, you integrated probably very quickly, right? Like in a sense of, if you're reading a lot, you're like, what year did, like, how old were you when you got to?
I moved here when I was 4 years old.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
When do you feel that you really mastered the language? Do you remember?
I think it was about, middle school. Like I sort of knew already, like that I spoke the language. Like,
yeah.
And when I was in elementary school, I was always chosen to do like the school ceremonies or whatever, because the voice that you hear right now is the same voice I had since like 6th grade. Like I would answer the phone and they're like, hello, can we do a survey with you? And I'm like, I'm 14. Like, what do you want from me? And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, you sounded much older. But yeah, so I had this like deep voice. I had really good enunciation of words. So I would always be chosen to like read texts.
Got it.
In these ceremonies. So pretty early on, I caught up with everything. And so I did all the checking the boxes all the way through the army. And then only after the army and after this meeting, like with Russian speakers, I was like, okay, there is a part of my identity that I've neglected for many years. And in like 2015, when I went to university and everything, there started to be an awakening of Russian speakers in Israel, surrounding like the New Year's celebrations, the Novi God, which now is a huge thing in Israel. But in 2015, it was like this sort of family holiday that we hide from everyone. Like we do it with our families, and then we go out with our friends to celebrate New Year's. Like you do Novi God with your family, and then you go celebrate New Year's. Or Sylvester, for some reason that it's called here.
It's from mainland Europe. That's what we call it. So
yeah, but like this was what it was called here because I think like German Jews in like the 30s brought it with them. Yeah, and then Russians came here and were like, "What is this Sylvester? We've never heard of him."
Sylvester Stallone from Rocky.
Yeah. And then they were like. There was backlash because they're like, oh, Russians are not Jews because they're celebrating Sylvester, and Sylvester was an anti-Semite, which also was like bullshit because he never was like he wasn't any more or any less like Jew hating than any other like character in European history, and it was but Russians were like, who is this Sylvester? We're celebrating Novi God, like the new year. That's it. But the thing is, because it has like similar characteristics to Christmas. Like you have presents, and you have a man with a beard and dressed in red bringing presents. So like, and a tree and all that. So it looks like Christianity. Mm-hmm. It's actually it's a whole story of a compromise with the Soviets about like having a civil holiday. That has some of those characteristics, but has nothing to do with religion because religion was forbidden.
Right. Do you feel that this is a good thing to have not just a mainstream of holidays that are specifically Jewish for the country, that you're allowed to have a national identity of some kind, but within that you have subsects of things that you're doing in that way. Do you think that's better for the country to be able to allow those differences to exist as long as you have a national identity first?
I mean, one of the things, and we can go back in history, and like the idea in 48 was this crucible of like taking everyone, stripping them of their differences and creating this new Israeli.
Right.
And I mean, it's a very ambitious thing, but also you sort of take away from people everything that makes them who they are, because you want to create a new Israeli, or a new national identity. And I think you can see over time in history that rarely works. And I think one of the things that we're seeing today is, rather than like, if you have this base level of Israeli, and then you have these different identities, what you can do is you can either build up another layer of being Israeli that integrates all of these, or you can try to tear down the second level and sort of like trying to eliminate all different, which is, by the way, a very Soviet communist thing of sort of like,
oh, for sure,
eliminate all differences rather than like celebrate diversity.
Right. And then in some instances, a lot of people would say that nationalism is it's a necessity to create the country and the values and the ethos for which you stand as a statehood, as a peoplehood, and everything else. But some would say that here the nationalism is kind of stalled, right? And any attempts to have a universalist approach, not only from internal perspective to allow the differences and the diversity that you were talking about, which I think is important and crucial, not only for the internal part of the country, but the rest of the world to show off the immense diversity that the country has in that sense. How do you get more conservative thought leaders to be open to the differences and allowing people to live and let live, as long as the overarching goal is to be proud of the country and who you are as an individual?
That's a question with a lot of subsections.
Yes,
but
that's the way I like it.
Even before like the PR of sort of showing the diversity of the country, if you don't celebrate the diversity, you're putting people in direct conflict between two identities. Mm-hmm. Because if you only have those two stories of like Israeli and like ethnic culture, then you will eventually have a collision between those two. And people will be forced to choose. Am I more Russian or am I more Israeli? And without celebrating those, without like Russians going to a mimuna for the Moroccans, or meeting like Ethiopians on Sigd, or doing Novi God, like if this remains for every community for itself, then they will eventually have to choose. And unless you build that third thing, when you mix and like have these people going to celebrations of other groups, then you're building a healthier society that doesn't have to like compromise or pay a price for choosing just one. And you can celebrate many of them. And I've seen some criticism here about like Israelis celebrating, especially in Tel Aviv. There's some criticism about Tel Aviv celebrating Halloween or Christmas, or not even from the religious aspect, but just like people like to dress up and go to parties.
Yeah.
But like, no. And when you see conservatives, they'll be like, oh, this is terrible because we're losing our religious identity. And like, if you force people to choose, then they will choose and you will lose them.
Yes. But
if you embrace it, if you allow it, if you give the space to it, then you won't be competing. You'll just be, I don't know, you can be a consumer of it without like signing up for it. Like, I can go to Nazareth and enjoy Christmas,
which a lot of people do,
without celebrating the birth of Christ.
Right.
Like, I don't register for the religion, but I'm happy to like seek the lights and get gifts, because who doesn't like gifts? And
well, between that and just having a mutual understanding and respect for that diversity, right? In a sense, we go there, you see the trees, and obviously many Russians went up there to go check it out. Some other people, you know, they do their thing or whatever, and that's fine. But when, like you said, I've had people that when you ask them, oh, like, what'd you do for Sylvester? Or what'd you do? Like, I don't celebrate the civic New Year. Mm-hmm. And like, I don't know where, like, if you don't celebrate, that's fine. Be like, all you have to say really is, I don't do that, or like, I didn't do anything. But to bring into the context of you are trying to stand out in showing that you're doing maybe something in a more Jewish way by not celebrating it, I think has some complications to it, in a sense of like, you're trying to pick a fight with me on decide, and you're trying to say you need to make a stand. You can't have one foot in, one foot out in the real world and then in Israel proper, in that sense. And I love the fact that, for example, that Novi Grod is like a thing now here, just in a sense of like, we're allowed to, like, I know from any of the Russian speaking Jews that I know in the States, they have Christmas trees. It's not because they believe in Jesus or anything else, because that was the thing that you did in the Soviet Union. One, to fit in. Two, to figure out, like, you know, like, to be a part of something in that sense, because it's kind of, we already alienate ourselves in so many ways, but to be a part of a feeling of a community in that sense, you just do what everybody else generally does, and those traditions continue even if you live in another country in some ways. So like, I applaud that the Russians here, at least, you know, that are sticking to their guns and saying like, this is who I am. Doesn't mean I'm any less Israeli than you are because you wear a kippah and you walk around and you are, you know the Tanakh better than me or anything else, but like, this is who I am, and I contribute just as much to the society as you. So
sometimes even more.
Yeah,
I think one of the sort of, I would say, one of the biggest angers in the Russian community is sort of, Russians are hard workers.
Yeah, and
so when the community, we came here and sort of like, we pay taxes, we serve in the army. And then we have who's the one who's deciding who's Jewish enough to be in this country is a sector that doesn't serve in the army and mostly does not pay taxes.
Right.
So like, who's contributing more and who has the say? This sort of dissonance is something that's a big annoyance to the Israeli society in general, but particularly for Russians, because it's mostly secular. Very much contributing. A lot of people say like, this is the Aliyah that saved Israel,
for sure,
because it brought so many people with higher education.
Oh yeah,
and like,
but you hear the stories of like the scientists that were taxi drivers initially until they could, like, you know, master the language enough to actually go and get in their job. You know, like that example right there tells you. My
mom was a doctor, and she cleaned houses for a time before she could like sort of do the requalification
right
in Hebrew. But she cleaned houses, or she tells me like about times when on Saturdays she would go to a kibbutz and like pick grapefruits or whatever before she was able to sort of work again in her profession. And my mom was relatively young and she was able to do that, but a lot of people weren't able.
Right. What is that? When you hear stories about that, about your parents like that, what is, just from a personal standpoint, how do you feel when you hear like your mom like busting her butt like that, you know, your dad coming here and integrating in the same way? How does that, what kind of feeling do you resonates with you on that? And then how does that play into your life today?
I mean, I think it's an immense sense of pride of like people who come here without knowing the language, and just sort of like doing whatever they need to survive and ultimately flourish. Mm-hmm. But this is like, I can't imagine. My mom was 26 when she moved here, with a 4-year-old and trying to sort of like figure out a country where she doesn't speak the language. It's not like if I move to like an English speaking country now, I'll be fine.
Right.
But this was, I don't know, also in the 90s, pre-internet, pre-everything, and it was such a I don't know, an amazing thing for her to do.
Right.
And it's really like clawing your way out of the situation. And I think I did what most children of immigrants do, is that they make the extra effort to be as integrated as possible. So a lot of times, like, I think even in the US, like children of immigrants would often try to be as American as they can.
It's a very common thing, to be honest. Any Russian that I've met here probably knows Hebrew better than the average Israeli, is ridiculously higher educated and maybe even transferred industries that are completely different in that sense. And just to give you another example, a buddy of mine that I was in the army with in the States, he made Aliyah. He speaks 5 languages. You know, like, it's just one of those things. I think it's like our parents, right? I think it's subconscious, right? Like, we don't realize how hard they're working, but it becomes to a point where, like, we just think that's how it is. And so we get to that point and we're like going vertical on all our peers because they got it kind of easy. But we just have an example of the hard work and the dedication to integrate that much faster. We don't realize that you're going to catch up that much faster and then just literally go vertical on your competition and who you're going to be going up against for schools and positions and things like that. So I always find it super fascinating because my mom doesn't have like any formalized education. In Germany, you kind of take a test around like 8th grade or so where they kind of decide whether you go to college or not, which is a lot of pressure on like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, right? But you have, what they have is like Fachhochschule, which is like, it's like high school equivalent. And then you have Gymnasium, which is like college prep. And so you take that test and it kind of bifurcates there. And most of the people from the one end go to like trade schools and different things like that, where very skilled work and things like that, where you are an apprentice and you work under somebody from everything from carpentry, electrician, car dealer, you name it, right? Like these really, they're professional jobs in that sense, right? And then you have the other people that go straight to university, right? And I think it's what Israel does really well here in that same sense is that we separate people with the aptitude to excel and we put these people together to force them to work hard. Like if you are in a class with a bunch of other people, like it's going to be very boring for you because everybody is not on your level. So Israel, at least, especially by the time the army happens and you pass your bagrut and all that stuff and they're like, oh man, Aaron's smart. Let's put him in over here with these other nerds and let's see what happens, you know, because pressure makes diamonds kind of scenario. And a lot of those guys end up doing like really cool stuff and are actually interested in what they're doing, and they can take that knowledge and that skill set out into the real world and create value on the outside in certain ways as well. So I think Israel is really, really good on that. Do you think that the country can continue to produce and evolve and innovate in the same manner as it has in the last like 25, 30 years with tech, with the things that we have going on here?
I think one of the things that sort of helps this sort of innovative environment, and this is about Israel in general, and we'll get to like this time, is Israel always faced challenges. And I realized that when I went to Europe, when I was just there, and like everything is so easy, like and it creates people who are unchallenged and in a way don't look necessarily for new solutions or ways to improve things because like it was just handed to them. Like this is how society works, and that's how you take it. And I think because Israel and Israelis are constantly challenged through the army, through whatever wars and whatnot, because we're always challenged, we're also challenging reality.
Right.
Like, and we're not afraid. Also, this chutzpah thing.
Yeah.
We're not afraid to ask why is something happening the way it's happening, and why shouldn't it be better. And so I think this sort of sense of constant improvement is this sort of what's leading us in innovation or whatever. And the world is noticing, and Israel is becoming this sort of business hub. But it comes a lot from the army.
Yeah.
But also, I saw a very interesting example in one of the talks we had. They showed us kids in Israel getting ready for Lag BaOmer.
Yeah.
Which is like doing like a campfire or whatever for a holiday. And they're like, there are a bunch of 8th graders who need to find like wood and organize the food, and like this is how you build a startup. And you have like just a group of peers that's doing that without necessarily any external help or whatever. They just find the resources and do it on their own. And this sort of like this innovative spirit that even starts it with kids.
Right. But don't you think that the end goal would to? I just think, given the political landscape and the nature of the environment in the region, like the end state would be to eventually want to have something of a European-like system, right? In a sense of peace and security, prosperity, socialist outlook on life, where everybody's contributing in some facet, and then those contributions, whether it's talent, time, or treasure, are going back and reinvested into the country in some way. I mean, will this be a perpetual cycle of instability in this particular place? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do we want a European style mentality where everybody feels safe, feels happy, feels content in Israel? Or do we want the constant struggle to be able to continue to produce and innovate in the way that we have in the past?
First of all, I think we take this because we're living in this situation right now. We take this like peaceful Europe, whatever, as granted. Although most of history, like Europe was the most war-torn continent. Like we're looking at Israel that has like 70 years of like wars every now and then. But if you look at like European history, just as Israel was created, Europe was still coming out of like the biggest war in human history,
right?
And still under the Cold War. So like framing Europe as like this peaceful haven, it might be true for like
the last 50 years or
50 years or so, like Eurovision and whatever, and all these sort of like projects. But this is something that's relatively new, and we still don't know how it would look if we're looking at Brexit and all these sort of things. Also, the whole concept of the European Union is kind of goes back to this: are you tearing down the differences between countries, or are you building up on those? And I think the UK was sort of looking at it and saying like, okay, I don't want to give up my culture, or I don't want to give up my sovereignty in certain fields. So I would rather take a step back. And I think a lot of the countries in Europe are looking at that and sort of questioning whether they want to stay in a system that's like controlled, honestly, mostly by Germany, I guess. In
Germany, France, here in the
yeah.
There's so much shift going on right now because obviously Angela Merkel is retiring. And so having that stability of somebody that you knew what you were going to get has its merits. But also now with the new fields and everything else, like things are really changing. I think France is going to play a more pivotal role here in the near future, just based on their economy and like what they bring to the table as far as the Schengen zone. economically and in many other ways. Germany's kind of in an interesting place, right? Because Europe as a whole is very stagnant right now, as you probably would allude to as well, just based on the options that you have, the economics and the comfortability that we see, in a general European life. Like, I pay my taxes, I do this, it's generally peaceful, we don't have to worry about too much, and that's the end of it. And I wonder what lifestyle's better, right? Like, I had to leave one because that lifestyle of that getting complacent didn't sit well with me. And I have the option of going to the States based on my father, So that was an easy decision for me in that way. But when you face capitalism head on, like in the free market or quasi free market, as we'd like to call it in the States, right? It could whip the dog shit out of you. There's no social safety net in some ways, right? And I just had to make a conscious decision not to go back to my parents with my tail between my legs and be like, I couldn't do it. So I always have the appreciation of the failure, right? And that's what I really relate to with Israel, right? You're not afraid to like say, fuck it, let's figure it out. And if it doesn't work, we'll probably learn something for it, and those lessons will help be successful in 2 or 3 tries after. That's what I really respect about here. And you go from there. We're off. Ooh, batteries are dying everywhere. Where were we? So, we talking about the innovation of the country and how you kind of grew up in that mindset, but then also afterwards, like you finished the army, and then what did you do? Did you travel? Did you go somewhere? Did you stay around? Go to college?
So I didn't have money to travel.
Okay.
But I did like hiking and whatever. So I went to work as a security guard for field trips and delegations and whatever. I did that for a year. And afterwards, I went to a summer camp in the US and was their archery instructor for the summer.
Okay.
Which is a funny story on its own. When I had the interview to be the archery instructor, it was like this Skype interview. This was pre-Zoom. So it was a Skype interview. And I was asked by the leader of the camp, what is the most important thing about archery? And I had zero understanding of archery, but I was a sharpshooter in the army. So I was like, okay, and he asked me that, and I was like, I figured what is the best answer for me to get into a summer camp with kids? I was like, well, safety is of course the most important thing about archery. And they looked at me and they were like, oh, that's a good answer. And I got in. So I spent 3 months in the US, mostly in the camp, and then I traveled a little bit.
So what do you think is, obviously this is probably your first time to the US, so like what was your overall impression like of American Jews, but then also the US as a whole, like based on growing up behind the Iron Curtain and having probably some ideas in your head already on like what it was like?
I'm going to say some things that aren't very nice.
That's all right. No.
But I felt like this is a country of people who are not challenged enough. And maybe it's because I've met only like American Jews, but it's like everything seemed like very easy. Yeah. And it was like the US doesn't have like an existential threat constantly, and like there's not
they create the existential threats.
Yes. So like there's not that pressure or like this in the army you have something that's called metach mivtza'i. Okay. Which is basically this like a baseline tension that you have to be in to sort of be ready to spring into action. Okay. So like you don't have that. Like everything that I've experienced was sort of like a lot more chill in the US compared to Israel.
Yeah, but the irony is that you moved to Tel Aviv, and it's exactly what you're describing in that way. You know what I mean? Like, it's the Sababa mentality, you know, like.
Yeah, which is something I realized afterwards.
Yeah.
But back then, that was sort of my impression of the U.S. That nothing was like challenging on a national level,
right?
Let's say.
Yeah, for sure.
But on a personal level, I think people have their day-to-day struggles, and when you talk about like capitalism, this sort of constant competition between people, constant sort of like survival of the fittest and whatever.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Like, capitalism is like being in nature, and it's finding the easiest route to a meal or to survival or whatever else, right? And that's just how it goes.
And I think when you talk about Israel, you have this, it's geographically as well, it's between East and West.
Yeah.
And I think it's somewhere between like the East tribalism, sort of like living in a big tribe in a big village,
mm-hmm.
to like the Western sort of ideology of capitalism and this sort of survival of the fittest. And you can sort of see this mix in Israel of people who have this sort of safety net, social safety net.
Yeah.
And at the same time are very competitive and very like want to be overachievers in a way.
Do you think that the mix of Ashkenazi and Mizrahim, like the difference between, you know, European Jewry and Arab Jews from around the Middle East played a role in that duality of the tribalism and the socialist capitalist systems that we have here today?
Mm-hmm. I think these two things, one looks at and says like, you should stay close to home, you should help your family, you should be, and that sometimes can even trap people in where they're from, particularly if they're from a lower socioeconomic background. And a lot of the time, like the, let's say, Western culture is focused on the individual, is go and fulfill yourself and achieve whatever you want to achieve, and don't worry about us, like come back to us when you've achieved whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
And like do it for yourself, and we're here to help you do things for yourself. And a lot of times in, like, let's say the more Eastern cultures, is you're here for a collective, you're here for the family, you're here for the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And like you're doing this to provide for your family, not for yourself.
Where does the Russian community fit in that, in the differences? Where do you think they fit in on that, on the more Western kind of mentality or the Eastern?
So I think it's a Western mentality with an Eastern necessity.
Okay.
Like, because a lot of these families, like my family, came here with nothing. And I mean, my family's done pretty well for themselves. But a lot of these families, like, you need to go and get a better education and be successful. However, your family might need your help.
Right.
Not because this is the value, but it is the reality.
Right.
Like we don't want to need your help.
Got it.
Like
they're forced into being in this behavior as opposed to it being the value and the traditions that are passed on. Makes sense. So you were traveling, you got to see probably a very sheltered look of the U.S., but also a very realistic one when it comes to diaspora Jewry. Did at that time, were you already thinking about a career in working with diaspora Jews, or is that like, did that kind of open the door, Pandora's box, on like what you're doing today and what you have done in the past as a professional?
I mean, back then I was hell-bent on Israeli politics. I was like going into like Israeli local politics and like doing that change because it was still very idealistic from my youth movement.
Yeah.
And I went to study political science and international relations. And when I started studying international relations and I started working in the Knesset as a tour guide, suddenly local politics seemed very, very small, because I was back then when you're a kid in a new country, you're like, okay, this is where the power is. This is where like everything is decided. And I was like, I want to go into that. And then I got there and I was like, oh, there's so much more. There's an entire world, right, that I can be a part of. I can influence. I can I speak relatively good English. I can this is something that I understand and I may have value to add to it. And so then I sort of had this crossroads between, when I graduate, what do I want to do? Do I want to go to the politics direction, or do I want to go to international relations direction? And I talked to people in both spheres, and people would say to me, oh, you can always go to, I wanted to do like the shlichut, like to be an emissary of the Jewish agency or whatever. Yeah. And I wanted to do that, but I also wanted to be like a parliamentary advisor to one of the members of Knesset. So these were like two paths I saw in front of me. And so when I talk to people from the Knesset, they're like, well, you can always go abroad and do this, and like, so start with the Knesset and then go abroad. And when I talk to people who did shlichut, they're like, well, you can always go back to the Knesset, but like go abroad, and like that was unhelpful. And I decided to go to work with students as an Israel fellow, because I felt like I'm finishing university, I'm still young, and like I know what it's like to be a student, that this is the perfect time to go and work with students. Right. And I can go back to the Knesset at any point. And I decided to do that and signed up to the Jewish agency and all the process. And then I started the process to go to the US as an Israel fellow. And I went through the process, and they were very, very impressed with me and all that. And then I got an offer from a friend in the Knesset to do an internship in the US. Got it. This sort of Israeli-Palestinian internship program in Congress in Washington. Got it. And I was like, as a poli-sci nerd, this was like an incredible opportunity to go and see that. And I
how long did it take you to make the decision?
I had to get accepted first. Oh, okay. So I got accepted by the Jewish agency already. Right. And then I did the whole application process and all that, and they accepted me as well. And then I had to decide. Got it. And for me, the thing is, it had three different things. Either because of the dates, it was either I do the internship, because it was internship, exams, and being an Israel fellow. And I could only do two of them. So I could either do the internship and be an Israel fellow, but then not graduate. Yeah. Or do internship in school, or because like either
the timing.
Yeah, first term exams, second term exams. And so I decided to go for the internship. Okay. Because it's an opportunity I thought I would never get to do again. Right. So it's meeting Palestinians, it's working in Congress, it's meeting like Jewish, but not only Jewish congregations in the US. So it was really interesting.
So what was it like working hand in hand with Arabs that live in this country in the same way, and representing the country outside of Israel in that way?
So it was a mixed, I mean, two of them were like what we call Israeli Arabs. Yes. But the others were Palestinians from the West Bank, right? Like proper Palestinians. I'm not going into the whole debate of like self-identification versus right. All that.
But just working with people that generally aren't Jewish and Israeli, like in that context, like what was that? Was that rewarding work? Was that, were there some challenges working with people with such different experiences in the same country that you've grown up in and that you inherently value in as a part of your identity?
So first of all, when I was thinking about going to there, I still was thinking about the next step as well. If I'm going to be an Israel fellow somewhere and I get asked, have you ever met Palestinians? And like, I wanted to say yes. Like, I've met with them. I've spoken to Palestinians, and like, I understand the narrative. And this was what the program was about, bringing different narratives and listening to each other. And so for me, it was a great experience. And the guy I interned with is one of my best friends till this day. Like, we keep in touch. We met in the UK afterwards. Like, we keep in touch.
Nice.
And we had a great relationship there, like on a personal level.
Right.
I think on a like narrative national level, it was not as a successful program because it didn't necessarily fulfill its own mission statement of like creating a new narrative for these two groups.
Right. Do you ever think that the narrative can possibly merge?
I don't know if merge, but what I experienced there is I had a real inspiration about the Zionist story, actually, because they were talking about like establishing a Palestinian state and whatever, and I was like, okay, but there's so much to be done to establish a state. And then when I was sort of like rolling in my head what was done to create Israel, there was so much infrastructure work, so much like political work done before that. When I was in the Knesset, I used to tell people like Israel was a democracy before it was a state, because all the institutions already existed by the time we got to the declaration of the state.
Right. It was just like a bow tie wrapped up within the Jewish agency, basically part of the Yeshuv, which was essentially the governing body of the area.
And you already had political parties, you already had like a healthcare system, you already had all those. They of course had to evolve into a state level, but you had the infrastructure for a state already there.
Right.
Like Ben Gurion didn't, people often look at it and say, okay, he declared a country and then they started building. No, we started building and then he declared a country.
Right. Do you feel that the Arab population in Ramallah and those areas are inherently doing the same thing? Are they building a possible nation with the infrastructure in the same way the Yeshuv did, but doing it now in our time as opposed to before the state of Israel existed?
I don't know necessarily what is going on, and I think this is sort of something that receives a lot of opposition in those territories, because the sort of, at least from the narrative I understood, is they sort of see the creation of Israel as an imbalance, and the fact that they don't have a state as an imbalance, and only when that is resolved they can start building, which is sort of a in a way a backwards sort of way of looking at it. Like, no, it's like you build it and they will come, as Field of Dreams say. Like you first have to build something, and then you can declare it. Not like if you and this is we had the same discussion last time I was on the podcast, which is like you first have to do the work, and then you can like present it, and not the other way around.
Yeah, totally. Because if the folks there that are in the Palestinian Authority do not build the infrastructure, it would be a failed state, like from its infancy, and nobody wants that. If it went to that length to become a state at some point, I don't know if Arabs around the world would help in that sense as far as development goes, or any capacity like that. The likelihood of that happening is probably very minimal, but at the same time, you would just, the life and the situation wouldn't be much better than what it is today if they didn't plan ahead for that in a manner that would advocate for statehood even that much more. Like you said, like, it's very easy to, I think, maybe quantify the notion of statehood when you go to the UN and you go to other places where we're like, listen, we're got this thing wrapped up and ready. We just need to cut the freaking the ribbon, and we're good. You know, like, you don't have to worry about us. We're not going to be Haiti. We're not going to be in these other places. But I don't think they could push that narrative right now because of the simple fact of, and what I've read many books about is the victimhood on both sides, right? And how much that plays a part in it, you know? Like, at some point, as much as we have to get away from the narrative, and I think that's one of the things about Jewish culture that are impressive, but yet also holding the identity back, is when you look at what we celebrate are these near catastrophes, and then we celebrate it in that fashion, and then just it's the victimhood is built into the culture in certain respects. And I think we need to do a better job of espousing, and I think what you know, like the Scouts teaches and other things as far as the military is concerned, about the pride in oneself and understanding the history of the past and not letting it repeat. But you don't have to go to Auschwitz with all these teenagers in that same capacity and create like a Kotel-like environment in this place where it's so emotional, and you have alienated yourself from Europeans in that sense, because you're holding on to something that is almost now 100 years old, right? If Europeans did the same notion to other things that have happened back and forth, they would never have gotten past it either. Do you feel like the victimhood on Israelis and being such a part of their identity is a good thing, needs to change a little bit, or we need to kind of come up with a completely different outlook on like how you address the past with respect? But that's not my victimhood. Like, nothing's happened to me personally in the last 80 years, right? Because of the sacrifices that those people have made.
I think we need to separate like the Jewish at this point, from the Jewish narrative from the Israeli narrative.
Okay.
Because Israel was or Zionism was created to sort of go against the culture of the diaspora, of like being the perpetual victim.
Yeah.
And sort of taking our fate into our own hands in all kinds of different fields. Even like the classic one sort of example I like is Max Nordau, that had this like the muscle Judaism. Like his idea was that Jews don't need to be like these scrawny little like scrawny little Europeans that only study, but they need to be strong. They need to be like physically strong,
right? And
like Chadam thought about like intellectually strong, and like socialist Zionism was like Jews need to be able to work in the field and know how to like grow food for themselves. Like all these things sort of led to the concept of independence,
right?
Of not depending on anyone for defense, not depending on anyone for food, not depending on anyone for anything. This is how like all these different ideas led to this concept of independence,
right? Of
taking care of oneself. And when you think about like the Jewish holidays, yes, they're like Purim, oh, we almost died, but then we didn't, or Egypt, we almost died, but then we didn't, and all these other holidays.
Right.
And I think Zionism also took other stories and amplified them, like Hanukkah. They took the story of the Maccabees, and being like fighting against like oppression and like being independent, taking your fate into your own hands and creating like this sovereign kingdom.
But do you feel that they picked the right stories? Like, I personally, I don't particularly like the story of Masada, and I don't like it because of the fact that I just have a different notion. I was in the military as well. Mm-hmm. If I have any breath left, I'm dying with a sword in my hand. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to be dying through self-mutilation in a sense of that, you know, like one last breath in that way. Obviously, that's a very different topic in that sense, but just giving an example, I would rather the amplification of the story of the Warsaw Ghetto and the people that literally had no way out, but yet they chose to give it one last go in that sense. Like, that's more courageous to me than some of the stories that they picked. Do you feel that they picked the right stories in that sense?
So first of all, let's separate, because Masada was against the Romans,
Yes.
and the Maccabees were against the Greeks.
Yep.
So two different timelines.
Yep.
And I think the story of the Maccabees was like, we have something to fight for that is like important for us, and this is sovereignty and all that. And I think the story of Bar Kokhba and the whole rebellion that ended up with Masada was it was a lot more about religious extremism than it was about like self identification or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, this was because when you challenge the biggest superpower at the time, it has more hubris than anything else. And it was more about power, because they just didn't want to be governed by the Romans. When at the Maccabees time was, it's not just we don't want to be governed by them, but the Greeks, or like the Syrian branch of whatever, of Hellenistic culture, wanted to destroy Jewish culture itself.
Right.
Not just rule by force, but also like destroy these, like we talked in the beginning, destroy these identities, or like this thing. So it always comes back to that. Like, do you want to destroy the difference and the diversity? And I think that was a way of, we want to live in peace in the way we want to live. And I think the rebellion against the Romans was more hubris of like, we have God on our side, and we want to control, we want to govern because we want power.
Right.
And so I think these are two different narratives.
Yeah.
When we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto and Poland and on all these trips, I went on one with my youth movement, and let's say the usual narrative of like the school trips is basically, this was a catastrophe for our people. This is awful. This is what happened to us. And the message is often simplistic of like, if we had an army, this would not have happened. Go to the army.
Yeah.
Because you take 17-year-olds and you want them to go to the army. So you show them what happens if we don't have an army. And then they're like, okay, let's go to the army. Our journey was a bit more in depth, and it was about like the human psyche and like what brings a person to do something like that. We looked at it also from the German perspective. What brings a normal person to support that kind of leadership or do these atrocities? Like, as a human being, what happens inside of you, and what happens inside of you to rebel against something like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's countless stories of people kind of subverting the laws and things like that throughout that area. And I think obviously some of the movies that we've seen in the past, like Schindler's List, give an example of that, you know, that kind of human condition of somebody feeling something for somebody else to that point where their livelihood and their life itself could be at risk for helping someone else in certain ways. And it's just, it's crazy, you know, to think about how the 75 years, 80 years that this country's been around has had so much happen, you know, like it's so compact on every facet, every decade, the personalities and things like that. With all that, and you obviously well versed in history from a modern sense, but also from a biblical sense, do you what was your reasoning to continue to pursue politics, given everything that you've known and all that stuff, and obviously probably taking a step back to kind of figure out, is this really what I want? had some interesting jobs along the way. What keeps you in the fold to be an active participant, an active citizen in your society like that?
I think I'm very much impressed by the system that we were able to establish here. It has its flaws, many flaws. And actually, when I went to Congress, I was really inspired by a lot of the things I've seen in the U.S. Congress, in the House of Representatives, and for if we have American listeners, I know
that's pretty much all they are. So,
yeah. I mean, yes, I was inspired by the political system in the U.S. Two main concepts was one, the concept of interns, and the fact that like young people get involved in politics and have the ability, and it's a whole organized like project of having people intern for Congress people, which I found incredible. And I was like, if I were 19 in Israel or 21 after the army and I wanted to go into politics, I would have a way in. I found it amazing. And the other thing was the concept of constituency that we don't have in Israel, because Israel is just one big constituency.
Right.
And you don't have a member, like I don't have a member of parliament that is dedicated to me. Like
right.
if I feel that something's wrong, I don't know who I pick up the phone and call.
Yeah.
And when we were in the office of the congressperson I interned for, we would get calls every day of like, you work for me, I'm from your district, like you should say this and that, or you should do something about it. And I was like, this is amazing. Like people call and speak out their mind because they have an address for
right.
it.
Do you have in the political system here, I know like, so you have the party system, parliamentary system, people pick the party, but then that party has an order of merit list of some kind, and depending on how many seats they get, depends on how many people get into the Knesset based on the party. If you're a party member, do you get to vote for that list, or is it like, so basically one level down on like what you're talking about here, or it's just like you vote for that party, they pick their guys to be at their list, and then that's it?
So we used to have a lot of Democratic parties that would do that with like primaries in them.
Right.
But the more we moved, like the more politics became more personalized, parties just pick for themselves and you just vote for the party like without an influence on the list.
Yeah.
I think today we have about 3 parties that have this internal mechanism, which is Likud, Labor, and Merits to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And the others, just like you have the head of the party, he picks his people. Or if you're a religious party or one of the Arab parties, you have a committee of either rabbis or the equivalent in the Islamic parties.
Yeah.
And they pick the members of Knesset, and they pick the list, and then based on that they go to, and people seem to be fine with it. And honestly, it's a lot less of a hassle to go and pick. Also, not a lot of influence for that in my view. I mean, if they are not, unless they fully pledge that they're committed to a certain region or whatever, so like the Haifa representatives in the Labor Party or whatever, but other than that, there's not much meaning to that anymore.
Right.
Unless we divide the country somehow to voting districts, which I think we definitely should.
You think so?
I think so, and we need to find a way to incorporate everyone. So even maybe do like a list system within those districts, and then you don't just have one representative, but you have like 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And then if you take like the Ramat Gan Bnei Brak area, which one is very secular and one is ultra orthodox, then you can't just have like the majority of Ramat Gan deciding on Bnei Brak, but then again you can't have the other way around. So you can do I don't know, a vote in a list system in that district, and then you can choose like 3 representatives, and then one would be Orthodox, one would be secular, and one would be whatever.
Why do you think that? Was there just not enough people to have an upper and lower house, like the way Parliament is structured in England, in that sense? Like the House of Commons.
Definitely not enough people.
Yeah,
I think that's the thing. But those decisions were made when there was less than a million people in Israel, and now we're talking about like 9.5 million.
Yeah,
and that's also the answer I got in like poli-sci classes, that there's not enough people for that. But now there is, I think, in my again, the population here is the size of London. Yeah. So not that many people if you compare it to like the House of Commons and all that. Yeah. But I think it is a good way to sort of do it. I don't think the first past the post like they do in the UK is a good system necessarily, because then you lose a lot of votes that people got for other candidates as well. Yeah. So I think if you integrate that with list system where a district gets like 2 representatives, 3 representatives, and that sort of shows the diversity of that district.
You're starting to sound a little American here with the way the system is set up there. You know, it like you said, it's probably was an eye-opening experience to be able to live in that world in the U.S. Like I respect the U.S. and its system, and I think for the guys that set it up, you know, overall, obviously every system has its problems, right? But for the most part, since let's just say up to about 1970, 1980s, right? It really was a decent system in that sense of like standing the test of time. Like stuff was written 200 plus years ago, and it did okay for the most part, you know. Obviously hiccups along the way and everything else. What do you think that Israeli politics can learn from Americans and vice versa?
It's it's funny because when I was there, and it was like, let's say the pre-Trump era, the first time. Yep. I felt like people can talk to each other regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats. They can be neighbors. They can be, and here it was a bit more visceral, I would say. Okay. More like I don't know, like soccer teams, like soccer clubs. Like if like this is my team and it's a ride or die sort of way. Yeah. And I think with what's happening in politics in Israel right now, you see this sort of hateful rhetoric sort of calming down a bit with the current government, of like having people from left to right sort of sitting together and being like, we don't like some of your policies, we don't like some of your policies, but let's work on the 80% that we do agree on. Right. I really appreciate and admire this sort of approach. And kudos to Yair Lapid, who was able to sort of assemble this puzzle. Yeah. And people said like this whole government is only about like not being not Bibi or like not Netanyahu, but it's holding on. Yeah. And it's fine that you have disagreements. I don't like the fact that it's being a monolith, like coalition and opposition necessarily. Right. And I think this is what's happening in the US. Yeah. You know, you have Democrats won't agree with anything that Republicans bring, or Republicans will always be against whatever Democrats bring, regardless of what their constituency wants, regardless of like their personal values. Then what is the point of you being a public official, right, if you're just going to be like a monolith of your own party? Right. And I think this sort of division of coalition and opposition is problematic in Israel. I think rather than having ad hoc coalitions based on topics, because I'm pretty sure like Likud would be fine with ultra-Orthodox serving more in the army, but because they have this sort of coalition or agreement, or they're in opposition together, that they would automatically oppose. Right. And the same with the coalition of opposing to good stuff that the opposition brings up.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. You brought up a lot of thoughts in the sense of how things are on both sides. With this kind of rainbow coalition, we'll call it, of just every kind of different aspect of Israeli culture and society having come together, and maybe can you elaborate a little bit on living through. So for those that don't know, Israel has gone through 4 elections in 3-4 years, basically?
And at the time it was 2 years, like
Okay.
4 elections in 2 years.
Okay. So, with that, for those that are unfamiliar with the parliamentary system, you have your coalition of parties that are working together on issues, and they push legislation. Sometimes people will go with the coalition, with the parties within the system, and other times they will actually vote against stuff that comes up. But for the most part, they're together because they're in alignment with the majority of the things that are happening in that country in that way. A lot of times what would end up happening is that the government would fall apart, and there's this kind of, what do you want to call it? Like just a period of uncertainty, like in between the election, where nothing really gets done because everybody's
transitional government.
Right. So like people are essentially campaigning. They're basically getting out there and getting the message out there on what they want. And a lot of times in a parliamentary system, usually the prime minister or somebody else, if a coalition falls apart, they can use it to their advantage to kind of regroup, reassess the situation without having to actually be proactive in pushing legislation in that sense, and reforming their group to continue to keep the power and the authority within the framework of the country. Is that about a good estimation?
Yeah, it's kind of a reshuffling in a way.
And so living through that and feeling what you feel now with the current situation, do you think that was a necessary means to move away from the Benjamin Netanyahu era of Israeli politics and to kind of push further into a more cohesive government moving forward, rather than, or was it just everybody banded together for their own necessity to get this era over with already? What do you feel has been the positives and the negatives of having to go to vote 4 times, for example? The mental state of the citizens on having to have this kind of uncertainty weigh on them in their daily life. What are your feelings on that, having lived through that?
So first of all, I voted 3 times from the UK.
Okay.
Which was a very strange thing for me, because I was really involved in politics, and we sort of had this period of stagnation. We were like, okay, Netanyahu is the prime minister for 10 years now, and it doesn't seem like much is going to change. Labour Party is dying, and no one's really challenging Netanyahu. And then I moved to the UK, and suddenly they declared elections. And they declared elections because Netanyahu thought it would be to his advantage.
Right.
And they called for elections, and they went into elections, and that sort of did not go the way he expected. And I think Lapid and Benny Gantz, who sort of came into politics, they formed a bloc called Blue and White that got the same result as Likud.
Yep.
And suddenly we had 2 major parties again, after a period where Netanyahu was busy dismantling all his political opponents. And suddenly we're at an impasse. And it was either he was able to form a government, or usually if he's not able to form a government, then it goes to the next in line.
Right.
But to avoid that, he just dispersed the Knesset again and declared another election before it was able to pass down to someone else. So that's how we got to our second election.
This is when they made a vote to switched the prime minister position with somebody else, right? Like
before
the other.
that. Before,
okay.
Before that.
Got it.
So this is number 2.
Got it.
Then number 1 is just going to another election because they didn't like the results, this sort of reshuffling thing.
Yep.
And because Lieberman refused to go into government with Netanyahu.
Got it.
And so they went to a second election. Results were pretty much the same because nothing changed during these like 4 months. So, and they were unable to form a government again.
Right.
And we went to a third election. I hope I'm going to the timeline correctly, because at some point, Netanyahu did a move on blue and white and sort of, I would say, with lack of a better term, seduced Benny Gantz into going into government with him, promising him that after a year or a year and a half, he will become prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because out of the 4 people who were the heads of blue and white, he was not the candidate to do that, because people thought that Bogi Ya'alon was the more sort of like right wing in that sort of big megazord of the parties banding together. People always thought he was the usual suspect to sort of go with Netanyahu because he's more right wing.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, that was not the prism people should have looked at. But the prism was who already worked with Netanyahu and got burned. Yeah. Those people would not go and work for him. And Benny Gantz, who was still, at that time, I would say pretty naive. He was okay, they were all stupid and got duped. I won't be that stupid. Right. And then he was. And so he went into that. And so he broke up blue and white into 2 pieces and basically, again, did the same mistake that other people did. And Netanyahu, again, dismantled his political opponents. And he went into that with the promise that he will be prime minister in a year and a half. And like, he was like, here we have an equal government and like we have equal influence, even though I have like half the power now. Yeah. And he was like, I think he was convinced that he was going to be prime minister, and everyone who saw it was like, he's never going to be prime minister. Right. That's not going to happen. And it didn't. And Netanyahu did whatever he could. Like, people thought that this agreement was foolproof, and then Netanyahu did whatever he can to not make that happen. Right. And that's why they didn't pass the budget. And of course, when you don't pass a budget, the government automatically falls and you go into elections. Yeah. And that's how we got to the current elections, when, again, the blocks sort of stayed the same, but they were able to bring into the fold an Arab party. Yeah. And it was Netanyahu's own undoing, because he was flirting with them and he was talking with that party. And because he did that, it became legitimate for the other side to talk to them as well. Got it.
And from a tactician and a politician, I respect former Prime Minister Netanyahu very much. What do you think his overall legacy is going to be as a leader of Israel, but then also some of the positives and negatives that he brought along the way during his time as prime minister?
It's a good. I used to ask that question myself of like, what would be his legacy? Mm-hmm. Like, even before those elections. Like, he's been prime minister for 10 years. What is his like crowning achievement? Mm-hmm. And it's like, not much. Like, he stayed in power a lot of time. Right. But he didn't really achieve anything. Like, when you look at prime ministers that were like a lot shorter terms than him, mm-hmm. did like massive moves, like either wars or whatever that brought some sort of an achievement or whatever. Like Barak in the early 2000s was prime minister for like a year and a half, something like that, and he pulled Israel out of Lebanon, which was a huge move. or Sharon was like 3 years or something like that, and he like did the disengagement plan from Gaza.
Right.
And Olmert was also like something like that, and he did the war with Lebanon, and like, so Netanyahu, maybe some of the things we don't even know yet, like bombing the whatever in somewhere, Syria basically.
Yeah.
I mean, even Olmert, we just now learning that he sent bombers to bomb the emerging nuclear facility in Syria.
Yeah.
And like we've learned that only after he was like basically sent to jail.
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, so he stole some money, but like he fucking saved us from like a nuclear facility on our doorstep. And so there are a lot of things that we might not know.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Netanyahu, I think at some point he started identifying the country with him.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if he's not the leader of the country won't survive.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what he does or doesn't do. And I think he had good relationships to a certain degree with like Putin and Trump and that, but that what at some point it didn't service the country as much as it served him.
Right. Yeah, no, I like you said, I think you can't judge a presidency or a prime minister or any kind of person in the top position of a government in a country, I think until at least a decade after, because you don't know the secondary and tertiary effects of policy, because it takes time to implement, right? Just because a law gets passed, as you know, you worked in the Knesset.
Yeah.
How long? I'm sure the stuff that was passed when you were working there is just now maybe touching society in the way that it was intended. And it probably not even getting to where it needs to go in the same facet on which it was passed. So with that, you know...
but then again, he was in power for a decade. You would have seen some results.
Right,
That's very true. If he would have... I mean, he was very good at not changing anything. But then again, you never know if what you can sort of attribute to him and what you can't, because like the high-tech scene was really growing during his time. And is it related to him or is it not related to him? And I think a lot of the times it's also depending on where you are on the political spectrum.
Right.
Like if you're his supporter, then you're saying like, oh, it's all thanks to him. And if you're not a supporter, you're like, oh, well, it happened despite of him.
Yeah.
Like,
it's going to be an interesting one. Do you feel that at some point, though, like politics are ugly. Politics are very ugly here. Do you feel at some point that there were some genuine motivations on making the country better, and then just the power of the position that he held at some point just corrupted him to a point of where it just wasn't the same person anymore?
I think that there's a lot. There have been books written on it, and like documentaries and whatever. And when you look at him in 2003, when he was a Minister of Finance, and he did some very, very good moves in a way, but he was like cutting welfare and whatever. Like a lot of the ultra-Orthodox were going to work, and like this was, but it was a very unpopular move on his side.
Right.
But it was his capitalist ideology,
right,
which is a right-wing ideology, like very, very structured.
Yeah.
But it made him unpopular, and it made him fail in the elections. And I think since that point, he sort of shifted from, it doesn't matter what my ideology is, to what I think is good for the country, but whatever gets me elected.
Yeah.
At some point, I think he was a very, very good politician.
For sure.
And a mediocre statesman.
Okay.
I think that's sort of the things that you need to like. He was very good at getting elected.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if he was as good at getting things done.
So the execution part of it, like he could talk about a vision all day long, but as far as executing that vision, pretty average at best.
or hesitant or whatever. Like nothing moved in the like two-state solution process or whatever, or like strengthening like local alliances or whatever. And like I see, I don't know, maybe Lapid is better at advertising, but I see him jumping around between like Jordan and Egypt and all these like different countries, and he's like going around and like working on cooperation as much as he can, to sort of bring us to the next level. And I think Netanyahu's thing wasn't necessarily advancing us to the next level as much as like maintaining us where we are.
Right.
And he was constantly talking about like this, I'm keeping us safe and secure, and people are like, yes, but we want more than that. Like, we're past safety and security.
Right. And with the new government coalition and what you've seen so far, I mean, COVID obviously has affected every country in the world. However, Israel has played a very different idea on how to manage this pandemic. What are your thoughts on the overall country and how it took on COVID, how it locked their borders generally before anybody else, how they made a deal for the vaccine like way in advance? Like if you had to give Israel like a report card grade on dealing with COVID, keeping the health and safety of the people at the highest priority, where would you put Israel in that comparatively to the rest of the world?
So here we need to give credit to Netanyahu for striking that deal, and for we don't know like what is the price that, like, because the deal is still classified.
Yep.
But I guess he like did what he and honestly this is like the biggest credit to him of getting the vaccines as early as possible. And I mean, the lockdowns was, again, we're not an exception to how the world looks, and people are now like mentioning things that happened based on which lockdown they remember. Like, oh yeah, I did that in lockdown 1, or I did that in lockdown 2. I remember we met between lockdowns, and I think it was a bit of an ineffective technique. Lockdowns,
sure.
And I think that was one of the things that made people very unsatisfied with his government.
Right.
And one of the things that sort of led to him
getting ousted
in a way, because people started questioning, like, okay, if
same thing for Trump, by the way. So same instance.
So if lockdown works, like, why do we need another lockdown? And if lockdown doesn't work, why do we need another lockdown?
Right.
In a way, like, people started questioning the government.
Yeah.
And like its decision making, because there was so much uncertainty, and that, I think that sort of helped Lapid and Bennett like they were like, okay, let's try something else, because Netanyahu was Mr. Security.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was like the top, but then like the new challenge is not security, it's health.
Right.
And then and he like, let's bring other people, because healthcare is not like, okay, like missiles and whatever, we got this. Like, and I think the operation in May was sort of his last hurrah of sort of trying to shift the conversation from COVID to war, which he knows how to do.
Right.
And it didn't work. And I'm so proud of us for it not working.
Yeah.
Like, because it felt like such a propaganda tool.
Yeah. And how, you've been on the inside of the country in some really significant times recently, but then also on the outside. Going back to the election time, what was it like viewing your country from the prism of Europe, but specifically the UK during this election cycles that you had? And how did English people view Israel at the time, and you have to convey what's going on in Israel to them and kind of elaborate on that and give them more nuance to the situation?
So it's difficult to explain specifically in the UK during that time, because they have a prism of right and left, and that's it. Like, you have conservatives and you have Labour, and then you have a few in the middle.
Yeah.
And that's just one axis. And then you need to explain that in Israel there are 3 axes. Like you have right and left security-wise.
Yep.
You have right and left economically. So like capitalism versus like socialism, communism, whatever.
Yeah.
And you also have religion. So it's not exactly an X and Y axis. It's actually a box.
Yeah.
Like you have like X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And like
it's like 3D chess, you know.
yeah.
Like
so it's a 3D model of where parties are found, and it depends on what plane you're looking at, and it's a whole mess of like.
At least you said it.
Yeah, and like you have a whole algorithm of like based on like what you think of any one of those issues, you need to like sort of go there. It's a very there was a whole diagram of like what party you should vote for. And I mean, we had like 33 parties running.
Oh wow.
And like out of them now we have about like 12 in parliament.
Okay.
So like again, it's
what do you need to be officially a member of a coalition? You need 4 seats, right?
Something now it's 4 seats, but it used to be 1 seat. So
oh wow.
Like it was raised just in the last decade, I think. They raised the threshold.
Got it. Yeah, so like when you were talking with them though, did you feel like you had to defend yourself as an Israeli in some ways with people? Because you were in Oxford, right?
In Oxford, I traveled around, but yeah, right. Mostly Oxford.
Did you feel like you had to defend your country in certain ways and inherently defending yourself and like the values that you're bringing to another place, or was it more of a fluid conversation of trying to learn, you know, like from you being that emissary living in there and giving that context the way that maybe they want to see it?
So the thing is, like, I didn't even get to the part of defending specific policies because I was like, you know, I considered myself a lefty before I moved to the US.
Right.
To the US, to the UK. I was like, I'm a member of the Labour Party and whatever. Like, I'm progressive, woke, whatever. And then I got there and I was like, well, I think my country should exist. And they're like, you're a fascist right-wing nut job, basically, because you think Israel should exist, and Israel is like a fascist colonial whatever entity in the region and shouldn't exist. And I was like, okay, wow.
Yeah, not only that, but like the irony of like English people talking about colonialism and having a commonwealth to this day is kind of the funny part of it.
Yeah,
but
continue. That was one of that was part of the dissonance there. But so I came there, and one of the things that was I was shocked that I had to discuss whether Israel should exist or not. And I think the core of that, it's the thing of creating symmetry between us and the Palestinians.
Right.
Because at the moment, we're debating whether there should or should not be a Palestinian state. Right? Which is like, this is a debate that's happening. Should there be or should there not be a Palestinian state?
Within Israel or within the world?
The world, Israel, whatever. This is the debate that's currently happening.
Right.
And it is allowed to happen because there is not a Palestinian state yet.
Right.
And this debate was happening before 1948. Right. Should there be or should there not be a Jewish state? But we need to take into account the context and the time of when the question is asked.
Right.
Because asking the question has practical ramifications. If you ask now, should there be or should there not be a Palestinian state, what are the results of each of the answers?
Right.
If you say no, then a Palestinian state will not be established. If you say yes, then a Palestinian state will be established. If you ask the question about Israel pre-1948, should there be or should there not be, then the results are either a country is established or not established. But if you ask that the same question, and it sounds the same because you're asking that about the Palestinians. If you ask the same question about Israel today, when the country already exists, what are the ramifications or what is the operations that you need to take based on that answer? Because should Israel exist, should there be a Jewish state in 2022? If the answer is yes, then a country will continue to exist. But if the answer is no, what do you do then?
Right.
Do you destroy a country? It's the same question. Like if I ask about Palestinian state and if I ask about Jewish state today, one of them is establishment or not establishing.
Yep.
The other one is status quo or destroying a country.
Right. And I don't think people think about those after actions. Like to say that this should be one area called Palestine, whatever, right? What does that look like? What kind of government do you have? Or if you're saying like everything is so melded together now, right? Like, yeah, we have diversity in certain instances within the demographics, right? But there's not one person that I know today that doesn't have at least maybe a quarter Ashkenazi or something of a Mizrahi, Arab, Jew background, right? Everything is intertwined now. Where do these people go? Like, if you were literally going to take it apart, do these people go back to Baghdad? So you're literally going to send, 6 million people to their death again in certain instances? They're not going to make it, right? So I don't think people understand the reasoning behind the birth of this country. And I don't think they understand the nuance on what they're saying when they say Palestinian statehood at all costs with the dismantling of another country to meet that need. And I've talked with a couple of people about this, where this area has always had some kind of overlord of some kind, right? Mm-hmm. In certain instances, because it's too small. It's been an outpost for, like you were talking about before, Greeks, Romans, Persians, Babylonians, you name it, like this place has always had a caretaker living somewhere else. The self-determination factor has only happened recently, and that's to include the Arabs that have lived here. So it gets to the question for me, do you feel that these notions are rooted into anti-Semitism in a sense of like, you as a Jewish people are not allowed to have statehood in the same facet as everybody else that has an ethnic diverse background of some kind in that sense? Or is it just the fact that they feel that the injustice of the policies that Israel has implemented thus far have not been in alignment with the international community to a point where statehood should be deserved and kept? What do you think? Do you think it's more on a strictly anti-Semitic notion that this place shouldn't exist because of whatever happened, or because of the policies that were implemented since statehood onto dealing with security measures to keep the population safe in many instances in that sense, and being aggressive in nature to ensure that happening?
So there are a bunch of ways to go about it, and you can go at it from like in a sense from a right wing and left wing perspective, and sort of come to the same conclusion, which is something I encountered mostly in the UK, mm-hmm. of how like left wing and right wing anti-Semitism are coming closer together. Right. If you know the concept of horseshoe politics, that says like that it's not a straight line, but it's rather like a horseshoe when the extreme right and the extreme left are really, really close. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it, like from a right-wing perspective of, I'm going like all the way to like extreme fascism and whatever, and like saying like survival of the fittest of nations, and basically like you shouldn't be here because this is our land, and like you should just go away because we're stronger and this is our place, and you don't belong here because our group is better than your group. This is like from a right-wing perspective.
Correct.
And on the left-wing perspective is there should not, let's say from the best of intentions, okay, there should not exist a Jewish state because Jews should not feel ostracized than anywhere else.
Right.
Let's say, and that's why there should not exist a Jewish state, because Jews should feel welcome wherever they are.
It's an extreme universalism.
Utopia.
Yeah, like a universalist approach to things.
Yeah,
you know?
but then because of that, then Jews should have stayed in Europe or wherever they came from, and should not have created their own entity, because they should not be persecuted. But because we don't live in a utopia, because we don't live in a perfect world, then we need to find somewhere, like, we're going into the middle of, there should be a Jewish state that is able to defend itself from those who want to destroy it, and also from those who think it shouldn't exist, because we don't want to be dispersed anymore.
I don't know if you've kept up with some of the stuff that was happening in the States, but as you know, you've been to some of the summer camps and things like that. Most of the American Jewish population are very liberal in nature, and that comes from their Western European Ashkenazi roots, right? With that, they've been in a peculiar place because of the Free Palestine movement of some kind, or BDS, or things of that nature. They don't have the same connection to Israel as maybe their parents or even their grandparents do, because of they don't have cousins, family members, things like that here in that sense. But they've really, as they get to university and they read some of the things that Israel as a policy, from a policy perspective, has implemented and things like that, and they're correlating basically the Black Lives Matter movement in with any basically political struggle around the world of minorities being somewhat oppressed, either legislatively or forcefully militarily, right? And their promoting of Black Lives Matter, on one instance, is inherent with how they grew up and the values. I mean, you go to like the Selma March on the bridge and you see rabbis and other people in that same sense, right? There is an essence of nonviolence that is in Judaism as a religion in itself, right? Pacifism, if you will, like in that sense. So you see it on that perspective, and they relate very well with the Black community and with other minority groups in the U.S. in that same facet. These students that are Jewish, that grew up with these values, are now going in there, and they've added, instead of just Black Lives Matter, they've diluted the message, and they brought in this Free Palestinian stuff, and now they're hearing anti-Semitism for the first time in a way that they've never had to deal with it before. And it's been really, from an outside perspective, very intellectually fascinating to see what the next steps are for that person that identifies with these people in the struggle as a minority, but then is, regardless of whether they are Zionist or not, are lumped in with the people that are here and the policies that have been implemented in certain respects to Israel. And it's fascinating to see these kids having to talk their way out of it, in a sense of like, I'm an American first. I'm associating myself with your movement. I am here for support. And yet you're putting me and lumping me into a group that I may have a connection with and co-religionist with, but I don't associate with their policies in that same respect. And it's put them in a weird box to have to defend themselves as Americans first over. Do you think like these problems continuously exist and will continue to exist for not only Jews, but for other minorities living in other countries, to have to constantly prove national loyalty in some instance like that? And does that even happen here in Israel in the same facet as you see on the outside with minorities or newcomers from an immigration style having to come here and defend themselves and like, I'm just as much a part of this country as you, and I can have a difference in opinion? That's what democracy is about. Do you think that this will get better as time goes on, or are we just in a cyclical pattern of, as long as you have a country that is not a monolith, that is not homogenous, are we going to keep dealing with these problems down the road?
And this was just one question.
That's one question. Do you feel like the same stuff is happening over and over again, basically, in a sense of, I was just relating the American Jews having to deal with the essentially binationalism, but not in an instance of actually truly being part of another nation, you know, in that sense, because they just correlate everybody. Do you feel that, does that happen here, firstly? And secondly, you know, being multicultural in your sense, you know, do you have to constantly prove to Sabra, like true people that were born here from, you know, whenever, that I'm an Israeli too, in that same facet as American Jews do, in like the education realm and other places like that, that you have these movements of struggle, political struggle going on?
Okay, it's a lot to unpack, but I'll start from the farthest to the closest.
Okay.
And I think when you talk about BLM, is one of the problems of intersectionality.
Yeah.
Is when you group all oppressions together.
Right.
And I mean, it's a Marxist view of sort of like all oppressed people are oppressed the same.
Yeah.
Which is not the case. I mean, when you talk about Black Lives Matter, it's directed towards the authorities or towards the police and of people who want to be part of a country and are met with resistance or opposition from the country or itself.
Right.
Palestinians don't want to be part of Israel.
Not even the ones that live within Israel proper today, ish.
I mean, they live in Israel and they're part of it, and they have the passports,
right? And
like they're equal citizens. But Palestinians in the territories or whatever, which they're the ones with free Palestine. Like there is a military rule on them, which we try to diminish as much as possible with the Oslo Accords and whatever. But yeah, they don't want to be part of Israel, and those people don't want. I mean. Because if we equate the two, and like, it's not like that the Black Lives Matter movement wants an independent state within the U.S.
Right.
They don't want to turn, I don't know, Montana into like the black state.
Right.
That's not what they're looking for, but that is what the Palestinians are looking for. Because they're fighting Israel to have self-determination.
Yep.
And it's the exact opposite of the integration that the Black Lives Matter movement is looking for.
Right.
These are, in fact, two opposite movements.
Yeah.
Because one is looking for integration and the other one is looking for self-determination and, in the extreme cases, annihilation of their enemy.
Right.
Like, the Black Lives Matter movement isn't looking for annihilation of the American system.
No.
Or maybe in its more extreme circles, it does.
Right. There's definitely been, you know, like you said, in the extreme realms of the movement, I think there is something along the lines of some kind of nihilism, anarchism in that sense of just rather than working within the confines of the institutions, they just want to burn them down. And
which is very Marxist.
Yeah, for sure. It's just like, I can't beat you in the game, so I'm going to rip this board game apart. And that doesn't, if you think that's a good thing about America, right? Like, it's not as small as here. You can start over. If you really wanted to create like a black utopia of some kind, there's enough people in the country that would support that and would do it. And if you wanted to reinstitute like Tulsa, Oklahoma, the way it was like Black Wall Street in that same facet, there's enough capital. And other people would support that if you wanted to do it. But the thing is that, and what I pride about America the most about is the national aspect of the country. Your identity is the national part of it first. Your ethnic background, the individual, is second. As long as those are in unison, you can do what the hell you want to do. So if you want to get together and build a business of some kind that caters to whatever you're wanting to solve as a problem, right? Like that's cool, right? I think that's great. Just like we do as a culture and society within the framework of America, right? Like Jews have built their own kind of institutions along the way through either philanthropy or other means or business in that same facet to really push the envelope. You good on time?
Yeah, I want to find something specific that a friend of mine sent me. It has to do with intersectionality as well.
Okay.
Of like because besides that, you also have like the queer movement, like adding to that, and then you have like these signs of like queers for Palestine. and then you're like, why is it funny? Why did you just laugh?
Because it's counterintuitive for supporting a cause that would inherently throw you off a rooftop if you were actually in that area. The same thing like Daesh, like ISIS or Islamic State, was supposedly throwing people that were suspected of being gay off the rooftops, things like that. So
one of the things, let's say, how academia and sort of like are detached from reality in a way is like I encountered an essay that someone wrote called Palestine and the Will to Theorize Decolonial Queering.
Was that a sentence in English?
Yes.
Wow. Where do you even start with a title like that? Is that just like clickbait though?
No. This is academia.
Okay.
London School of Economics.
Wow.
This article posits a theorization of decolonialization in relation to queer as it emerges from the settler colonial context of Palestine. Jesus. Basically saying that the Palestinian movement is a queer liberation movement. Okay.
How you can correlate those two, I have no freaking idea. But hey,
you need
imagination,
circus level mind acrobatics to be able to reach those conclusions. But this is what intersectionality does. It says basically all people are oppressed in the same way, and therefore there is no difference between people.
Yeah.
But then somehow into that intersectionality, the only oppression that doesn't go in is anti-Semitism. Because Jews are equated with like white people with money and power, so you're not welcome into our oppression party.
Never mind the fact that most of this country is made up of like Mizrahi almost at this point now.
Or whatever, or Russian refugees, right. Or like, it doesn't matter because Jews is money and power, and this is like the oldest libel, and it falls into that sort of anti-Semitic rhetoric, and it forces sometimes people to choose. We talked about like those Jewish students. It forces them to choose between being liberal, and I do it with quotations, because either liberal or like quasi-liberal, or Jewish, and they have to like choose which identity they prefer. Yeah. Even though I think being Jewish is being much more liberal than, because the whole point of Judaism is this culture of arguing and culture of challenging like conventions and whatever. Regardless of the fact that we're now in the last, let's say, 300 years, I'm not including Reform Judaism for a second, but we're in stagnation with the ultra-orthodoxy of like sort of like being this monolith of Judaism, of what tradition is, and never sort of evolving or whatever. And Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism is sort of like moving forward with this of arguing and reading texts and all that. And it's strange how liberalism is becoming this sort of dogma, and religion is sort of going for like, we want freedom to do whatever we want. It's sort of this shift of like, one of them is becoming more open and not the one you expect.
Right. Yeah, I think like I look at it like these political parties and these movements are kind of like let's say you have a tent out in the desert, right? And you're welcoming, right? You're just like saying, let's bring everybody in, right? Let's create a community of some kind. But then you start to bring in people that just because you need more people and it becomes tribal in nature, you're adding more people to be bigger, to inherently maybe outvote a smaller group of people, right? In a sense of how you're going to do things, what you're going to do, all that stuff. And so it's fascinating to me because I think that these more conservative political movements have a better base because they have more standards on like letting you in. And so the people that you know that are in, that are committed to it, you know what you're getting, right? These kind of coalitions of liberal ideas and liberal values, what ends up happening is it tends to dilute the message to the point where it's just like you're eating your own, right? You can't be the person that is for gay rights now has to be for free Palestine, has to be for this, has to be for that. Like, wait a minute, I only signed up because we were about this. When you start adding more and more causes and more ideology within a group, it's just going to become fragmented to the point where it just eats its own, right? Perfect example is like my dad's like, I would say he's a very like modest conservative guy, like kind of middle of the road, right? Like very socially liberal. He doesn't care how you live your life, but you know, like pretty conservative overall. He grew up in the middle of the US, you know, he was in the military for like 30 years. So he has a very ideological outlook on life. Live and let live, but let's be fiscally conservative about like how we do things, right? And he's voted for Obama and other things in that same respect. But like the one thing that he talks about consistently every time I see him was like the trans bathrooms for the military. And it was just like, it was too much for him. Like it was a generational gap. It's like, I believe in gay rights and this and that, but like when you actually implement the policy from theory and bring it to fruition, and now there's 3-4 doors of bathrooms instead of just the two, you know, handicap one and then like whatever gender neutral freaking toilet you need to have. It was too much for him. And I think those are the people that you're alienating to being a part of the process. And it just astounds me that the base of the Democrats or the liberals in other countries are just burning themselves down with people that support them in many aspects. But when you allow this small groups, not only do they come in, but they try to wreck whatever you've built in that same facet. I'm just wondering, how do we stop that to where you're saying, okay, we support you in like what you're doing, but the main objectives of this particular group, let's say the coalition like that's in the government today, these are our platform things. You have to agree to these to get part of this. And then if you have another side thing, if we can get to it, we'll try our best to like, you know, push forward on this to make it easier. So let's say like wheelchair accessibility in Tel Aviv, which is like pointless, right? Like you have to just basically live somewhere that has an elevator and that's it. Like you can't bitch and moan about stuff that's built 100 years or whatever else, but you can create policies that from anything that's built from now on needs to have certain things, right? Like those are kind of the middle ground that we need to have in that sense. If you were starting a political party of your own and you had objectives that weren't the majority consensus, how would you as a person try to get your voice heard in a more socially responsible way to like affect change as a whole for your people and the things that you think about, but then also for the major points that don't resonate in the main topics of that coalition, how would you go about like creating a voice for the people or the unheard of whatever you were, into in that particular time?
So I want to first address what you said about like the so-called grouping like these struggles together.
Yeah.
And it's the same as what we started with the whole sort of like diversity within Israeli society.
Yeah.
Because if you imagine this sort of like, well, the way most of like buildings in DC are built, like the government buildings, you have like the steps, you have pillars, and then you have the roof.
Yeah.
So the steps is, let's say, the baseline. Let's say, so if we're talking Israeli identity, so like the baseline Israeli identity, the different pillars are the different communities, and then the roof is the overall, is like the shared identity that we build.
Right.
And I think the sort of liberal movement in the US is having the same problem.
Yeah.
Because it has the baseline of being liberal.
Yep.
But then you have within it these different pillars, and then they need to come to a coalition and build some sort of roof together. And instead, what they're doing is by combining all these groups together, they're just tearing down the pillars and just saying like, okay, this is baseline liberal, and if you're not all of this, then you're not liberal.
Right.
And you get canceled, and you get whatever. Like you don't even have the freedom to express different. Like the whole point of a coalition is not that you agree on everything, is that you are different people coming together for a specific cause.
Right.
Because if you don't do that, because otherwise you shouldn't be a coalition. You should be just one body.
Yeah.
And like coalition is the basis of coalition is cooperation.
Right.
And so this is the thing that defines coalition, the cooperation between these different groups. And if you want to erase the differences between these groups and say like, okay, we're all oppressed and that is the only thing that defines us, then people will naturally like distance themselves from that, because I'm not just defined by my oppression. I have something that guides me and that I want to fix, but it's not my entire identity.
Right.
And I think people who turn their entire identity into being oppressed is something that people find as a turnoff, I guess. Like I want to do better and I want to be in solidarity, but I don't want to be I want to be sympathetic and not necessarily empathetic.
Right.
Like I want to be able to help you without seeing myself as oppressed necessarily.
Right.
Okay? Because even people are more willing to help when they feel like they're more fortunate than others.
Right.
Rather than being less fortunate. Like if I'm I don't know, richer than something, I would be maybe more willing to donate to welfare rather than just saying like, oh, I'm oppressed as well. You're right. Like,
yeah,
it's not the same. And you need those different voices, because you can't just have only the oppressed something. You need allies, and those allies shouldn't be the ones oppressed, but you need people who are not oppressed as well. Like you didn't have only black people against slavery,
right?
And so we had abolitionists as well.
Yeah,
you need this cooperation, and it comes from different motives. One is like pure motive for survival, and one is a more moral,
altruistic
sort of like whatever like your, like if you're building a coalition, whatever your intentions are, fine, as long as it serves the same purpose.
Right.
It's a very cynical way of viewing it, but that is politics, and that is how you move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I really hope that here in the future that this is the start of something amazing, like in Israel, like with and I know I'm a realist, but I think having, let's say, for example, an Arab political party within the government is a good thing. And it's a good start to normalizing the relationship, to seeing not only Arabs within the coalition, but then eventually start to see them at different minister positions in that same facet to be able to exercise what I feel is a more truer form of democracy, because everybody that is part of the demographic population here will be represented in some way moving forward. I guess with the Abraham Accords, with the coalition, the way it exists today, do you feel that Israel has some good momentum moving forward here in the next decade to normalize relationships even further with the neighboring countries, but then also giving them a different narrative on what either they've been told or what they think they know themselves in that sense?
Absolutely, 100%. We're moving in a better direction. A lot of it is credit to Netanyahu and Trump, honestly, regardless of their reasons to do it. Like, I'm sure if you look at like other peace agreements that were done in like other places, you would see like they might have like these petty political reasons, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the end result. So like if it was for Trump to boost his status or for Netanyahu to boost his status, and I know a lot of critics were like, no, this is not real peace because we were never at war and whatever. Like, fuck it. Like now we're in a good place. Yeah. Like regardless of all the criticism, and I think it's a really good momentum. I think Bahrain and the Emirates were like test balloons for Saudi Arabia, because we already have relations with the Saudis that are not official. Right. And I think people are getting tired from the Palestinian issue, because it also doesn't bring them as much value as alliance with Israel. Right. And I think Iran is the bigger threat in the region. And I think most of the Arab Muslim countries around sort of see that Israel is not as much of a threat. Right. And on the contrary, like
it's actually like a force, it's a catalyst for the growth of their countries in certain ways. If you theoretically would have trade relations, economic incentives, like a lot of the R&D work could be here. You have already an Arab population that would be able to facilitate direct, bilateral, initiatives to go and push forward with that. You'd have, like you said, government officials that are a part of it. They speak the same language. They're doing some of those things in that way. And I think, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I've heard multiple people have the ambition to learn Arabic better, like that are like me, right? Like in a sense of wanting to be able to travel around in the region and know the language and know that particular part of it in a better way.
And the thing is, it doesn't come from like the utopian sort of, we want to love our neighbors. No, we want to do business with them. Yeah. We want money. We want proper interests. Yeah. And interests advances much more than sort of like these dreams and aspirations of like, let's just hug each other. Right. No, let's do business together. Right. And with business, to be a good businessman, you invite someone to your home, you sit down for coffee, you do that, but it has to have a purpose. Right. And this is a much more tangible purpose than just like loving each other.
And there's a reason why I think the world hasn't had like a big global conflict in the same way it had like in the mid part of the last century. It's because of the trade between countries and stuff like that, and it keeps like for example the United States and China honest with each other in a lot of ways because of the manufacturing and everything else that's been involved in China. America can't just say screw you, we're no longer dealing with you in that same facet, because they need each other in a very symbiotic relationship in that facet, right? Like we're addicted to theoretically consumerism and the ability to buy cheap goods at certain prices and things like that. And China is more than willing to facilitate that, to make sure that that happens with the global supply chain system. So it's just a perfect example of how when you open those trade relations, you both have mutual interest not to screw that up on many facets. Mm-hmm. And I think it just brings people closer together, and the notions of that we're so different. Like, I travel around in this part of the world very much, given the job and the nature that, you know, the nature of the job that I have, you know, but at the same time, I the more I come to Israel, the more I sense it like morphing into the region in a good way, not in a sense of they're losing their identity, but in the fact that we're actually coming closer together, and it's feeling as if it belongs in a more congruent way. And so I think that's just a testament to, like you said, you have to give credit where credit's due with Bibi and with Trump administration on really making this an issue. And rather than being coy or like giving the notion that, let's say, like an embassy is moving or something like that, like it was a pretty dramatic move in that sense. And I applaud somebody for actually just taking an action as opposed to just talk, you know. And as much as I was not happy with the administration in the last, you know, 4 years per se, and even this one is just like very inept in a lot of ways, and the representation of the United States on a global sense is kind of down in the tubes in certain ways right now. I want it to be better, and I want it, and you're getting this, and I don't know how it is here specifically, but like, for example, I have friends that are ex-military that are running for office now, so I'm super excited to see like what the next 2 election cycles are going to hold, because I think there's going to be just like an idea of going back to, and what you were talking about before, I'm doing something with that constituency comments that you made, you know, with your story, and like somebody calling you, they want that. They want the responsibility of taking and being the steward of an area of the country in a way that I think is lost right now because of the money and politics in the U.S.
I think that is, and I have tremendous appreciation for people in the military.
Yeah.
And I think that is the full sense of the term serviceman.
Yeah.
Because you serve your community. Yeah. You serve your people. And it's amazing for me that it extends beyond the military.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time, a lot of army people here become politicians, because I think it's sort of, if I take the cynicism, if I put the cynicism aside for a minute, it is like a mission they see for themselves.
Yeah, it's a natural progression, right? Yeah. Like, I'm taking off my uniform and I'm putting on a suit, but the overall mission is generally the same for me personally, but like the value of like representing a group of people or being in charge of a way of life in that way, you know, like where you taking care of your platoon or something like that. Let's leave on a positive note. When as things are moving forward in this country, obviously there's a lot of factors involved in like what makes a successful country. In your eyes, for the next decade that we have here, let's say to 2030, right? What do you think is going to make Israel a productive, successful society in the next 10 years going forward? From a political standpoint, but then from an individual standpoint as well, like for yourself, you know, different communities in Israel, like what's really going to be the narrative for the next like 8-10 years here, you think?
First of all, let's say let's call it the post Netanyahu decade.
Okay.
Is, I think, the ability to live together, and I'm honestly super optimistic, like with this government and with sort of like where we are right now. There was this whole story about like a really offensive song that was like posted around Novi God that sort of like was demeaning to like the Russian community, specifically Russian women.
Right.
And there was a big outcry, which is something that's never happened in like the Russian society before that. And it actually made a difference. And like radio stations are now refusing to play that song and all that. So I think the next decade would have more integration, more diversity, and more sort of celebration of that diversity within Israeli society. And I think the Haredi community will at some point be forced to do that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think not being in power is only doing good to the Haredi community, to the ultra-Orthodox community. And it's...
Because it's forcing integration?
Yes.
Got it.
And I mean, capitalism will work at some point, and I think their model of living is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And I think this current government is going to work on integrating them despite what their leaders want. That's like a whole other issue, but I'm optimistic about that as well. And I mean, this government is also not perfect and like does mistakes as much as any other government.
Right.
But they're opening the market. They're dismantling monopolies within Israeli society and the Israeli market as well. And they're doing a lot of good work in the short time that they've been in power. They're doing so much work that hasn't been done in the last 12 years. So I'm super optimistic about that. Regional, I think we're in a good place right now. I think also COVID sort of mellowed down these conflicts. Yeah. Because people are starting to take care of themselves, and like people don't have time to go to wars because like should we go to the battlefield? I mean, I know it's an open space, but like what if they're infected? We don't want to start fighting right now. It's like it's a whole thing. Let's just stay home.
That's funny because when I went to a conference in San Diego, like the light rail to go to the airport, like didn't break down, but like the barriers, like where the roads were, wouldn't go down. So they had to get a guy to jump off the train, hand crank the freaking barriers to come down. And I normally never get to an airport that early, but I had to run with a mask on through the Denver airport, and I about died, like running down the terminal and getting to where I needed to go. I can only imagine trying to wear a mask, KN95 during combat. Probably not going to work. So, but yeah, no, I totally agree with the sentiment that it's definitely chilled us out in certain ways, and I think we got back to basics on the human condition. On like what makes us unique, what brings us together. And I hope that in some ways we use this time as a benefit, as it being kind of like the great reset. When we look back on it and we're like, yeah, we were going kind of a wrong direction, like in a global sense. It kind of mellowed us out, and like we're going to figure things out in a better way, hopefully.
I think Zoom also like made everything more accessible. Yeah. Like, and now communicating with even with Gaza, for example. Yeah. It's much easier when people have access to like internet and Zoom, or people even from wherever in the world suddenly can like study online in like top universities, or like everything is more accessible. Yeah. And I think it's a good direction we're going. I'm optimistic.
Have you always been this optimistic?
No.
That's good.
I was like, let's say 5 years ago, I was very pessimistic about a lot of things, worldwide, not worldwide. But now like people are talking about climate change. People are talking about like things that need to be done. Yeah. And like we're in a good place, rather than like talking about like wars with North Korea and like Russia and all that. I don't know, ISIS, Taliban, like all these things that were like 5 years ago. Yeah. Like Syria, like I think after the, let's say, Arab Spring that turned into like the Islamic winter, basically, I was a lot less optimistic.
Yeah.
Like, because it was a sense that like everything around us is falling. Like Syria fell apart. Like Egypt was like
on the verge.
Muslim Brotherhood, whatever. Lebanon is now sort of collapsing still, which is something that like.
Yeah.
And before this sort of collapse started in Lebanon, they were already talking about signing the like naval borders with Israel and sort of starting to go into normalization as well.
Right.
So I think we are in a good place right now, and we can go better. And I think in the next 10 years, probably Saudi Arabia will jump on the wagon as well.
Yeah.
And because they are, in a way, the architects of these like agreements with Bahrain, with the UAE, and all that.
Got it. Does with this new level of optimism for you, have you considered being more politically active here in the near future?
Maybe, but not as much, honestly, because I'm pretty content with what is going on right now. I mean, I was, let's say 5-10 years ago, I was motivated because it was like this developed sense of justice, and I'm like, I'm the only one who can do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, there are pretty good people in power right now, so I'm like, I'm cool. If I can contribute, then I'm happy to.
Right.
But not like in this sort of like superhero, I'm the only one who can do it.
Right.
Like,
no, it makes sense. Like, as long as you feel that there's enough good folks to come together and to create the environment that you feel is not only the best for the country, but the best for all folks considering. And like you said, like, it seems like the government is really taking a bend but don't break kind of approach on many things right now. And I think it's what the country needs. I mean, I've been talking with folks about this time has been super interesting because it's been one of the longest times I've been here, almost 2 months. And everything is very chill, like in a good way, in a sense of, I just think people aren't as stressed out as I normally see them when they're here. I don't know if it has to do with Corona. I don't know if it has to do with just where the country is in life. But I think, like what you were mentioning, like having the certainty of knowing that the people that are in charge know what they're doing and are trying at least to do it for the people lets you sleep a little better at night. I feel like the tension from before doesn't it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's definitely the volume's down.
I think it has to do with the media as well, because you don't have to wake up every morning and by the way, Israel and the US, the same. You don't wake up every morning and read in the newspaper, oh God, what has he done now? Like, what has he tweeted at 2 a.m.? What has he said about whatever? Like, it's less stressful because you don't have to think about government. Yeah. It's just boring again. And it's like, it's so good that it's boring.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense.
So they're doing like reforms about agriculture and whatever, but nothing is catastrophic. Nothing is like, so like, it's boring. It's great that it's boring.
No, I totally agree. It's great to be boring. Well, thank you so much. We talked for almost 3 hours, so. But I think that's a sign of like, obviously respecting each other, and I love hearing your take on many things, and so I know that other people will definitely benefit from hearing more about the country and be more interested in knowing more about you as well. So thanks again, and we'll keep it going. You have to come back and give some maybe some updates on some of the changes that you've been feeling from a policy standpoint from the government here in maybe 6 months or so.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Yeah. The show is produced by myself, Ben, out of Denver, Colorado. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you consume the content. Audio versions are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon, and a ton of others. As far as the full shows go and clips of the show, YouTube is the best place to view it. Instagram would be another one to see the clips. Big shout out to Mike Xavier, a hip-hop artist based out of Vegas and LA, who allow us to use his music for the show. He also produces a show called Hip Hop and Poetry, owns Renowned Photos, and check his music out and anything else that he's got going on in Vegas or online and social media as well. One last thing, if you know someone interesting that you think would bring value to the audience in some way, by all means, email me or get in touch via social media, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on like who would be one of those type of people. Thanks so much, and look forward to continuing to produce for you guys.